Amps and DACs are like bread and butter for audiophiles. To some, they are addictive drugs. If you don't like what this month's newest offerings have, you need only wait a few more to be shown a brand new device. Today, we're going to look at an older device. Well, old in terms of audiophile attention spans. This is the Singxer SA-1, a $600 Class A headphone amp from China. Appos Audio loaned me the SA-1 to review. As you know, Appos is among a few retailers that specializes in audiophile gear. They've got competitive prices, excellent customer service, and a growing catalog of components. Check them out if you're looking for your latest audiophile fix. Now, let's delve into the SA-1. Singxer's target is measurements. They've developed a powerhouse of an amplifier, and their goal was to deliver that power instantly, hence the Class A architecture. As with most amp and DAC manufacturers, Singxer doesn't say anything about sound signature or quality. Their only comment about this is rather mystical. They say that, quote, "You can enjoy the sound of strong drive and control or try the loose and calm analog flavor." Whatever that's supposed to mean. The company provides some measurements, all of which indicate a very capable, transparent amplifier. In fact, Singxer says that when the amp is in maximum power configuration, you can expect up to 10 watts at 16 ohms, which is an insane amount of power that nobody needs. Of course, the SA-1 has dip switches to modulate how much power you actually end up getting. Singxer gives you the choice of selecting low or high output impedance. Low output impedance is 1.4 ohms in balanced and 0.7 ohms in single-ended. The high setting will provide 11.4 ohms balanced and 10.7 ohms single-ended. While an interesting feature, it pales in comparison to the 6 selectable impedance options on the Hafler HA75 DAC, which is now unfortunately discontinued. If you apply impedance matching rules, then there's just not enough value to the SA-1's high impedance setting, especially if you're using high impedance headphones. If you have headphones that are over 100 ohms impedance, then you've essentially achieved the rule of 1/8 on the SA-1. Perhaps a bit more selectability on the SA-1 might provide greater flexibility to customers. Physically, the SA-1 has an industrial design. It is made entirely of metal and sits on 4 broad feet that do not wobble. The front panel houses 3 toggle switches for power output, input, and load. You have access to a 4.4mm and XLR balanced headphone connections along with a 1/4-inch single-ended. The volume knob turns smoothly but does provide a bit of resistance for careful adjustment. The back panel houses the typical assortment of inputs and outputs. You get balanced and single-ended in and out. However, the SA-1 does not have a 4.4mm input, which some modern amps have started to implement. The bottom contains switches to modulate gain. Some might be unhappy with this placement, but it's not exactly a regular feature that you're likely to use. One aspect that is welcome is the ability to turn the amp off from the front. You can turn the power supply on the back, but the front panel will also let you turn it off. This feature lets you place the SA-1 against the wall or in a stack system without difficulty. Overall, Singxer's design is utilitarian but perfectly usable. There's no need for an amp to look complicated, and it, here, is built well. To test this amp, I use the same methods I employ in all of my amp and DAC reviews. Comparisons using passive AB switches and listening for audible differences is in fact the key. I conducted these tests in multiple phases, all of which you can replicate yourself at home with off-the-shelf parts and freeware. In Phase 1, I simply used the SA-1 for several weeks as my go-to desktop amp paired with my RME 80i2 DAC through balanced XLR. I used various headphones and IEMs and listened to high-res audio and also streamed low-resolution audio. In Phase 2, I plugged the SA-1 into various DACs. This included the Brooklyn DAC Plus, Matrix Mini I Pro 3, SMSL SU9N, the SMSL Sanskrit, and the Songcause LA-QXT1. I used an RCA and XLR switchbox to compare among these DACs as I listened on the SA-1. The goal was to determine if, after volume matching the DACs, the SA-1 seemed to alter the sound of any. In Phase 3, I compared the SA-1 head-to-head against a couple of alternatives. For this test, I used the Brooklyn DAC Plus as my source for all the amps and utilized an XLR switch box. The amps I used were the Shit Heresy, the Mastrop 789, Rupert Neve headphone amplifier, Gustard H16, and the Audio GD1 amp. The goal here was to figure out if there are any audible differences between the SA-1 and its competitors. Finally, in Phase 4, I listened to numerous headphones of various impedances to determine if the SA-1 seemed to provide sufficient power for perceived loudness. As always, within this phase, I used high impedance headphones like the Beyerdynamic T1 2nd Gen and hard-to-drive headphones like the Modhouse Argon. For all these tests, I used many headphones and IEMs. Within that list were the Avantone Planar, HD6XX, Rode NTH100, ZMF Icon, audeze LCD2 Closed, and the Head Audio headphone. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD as my primary source. I want to emphasize that there is nothing particularly difficult about doing these types of comparisons at home yourself. You should, and I encourage people to constantly test new gear. In fact, for the minimal startup cost of about $25, you can have a reliable A/B test setup. This is really the only way to distance yourself from the typical reviewer hype and the constant bickering among audiophiles. Now that we've talked about the testing methods, let's just get right into the results. In Phase 1, the idea was to determine if I encountered any usability issues. I didn't. While the SA-1 does get warm, and the longer you keep it on, the hotter it gets, I never thought it was unreasonably hot. The amp always performed as expected, and I did not hear any distortion or hiss or any other abnormalities with most of my gear. An aspect I found pretty satisfying was, well, the volume knob. It has a bit of resistance, which allows for much more careful adjustment compared to many other amps in the market. In fact, one of my biggest gripes about the Burson 3XR is that its volume knob spins freely and lacks the physical resistance necessary to smoothly navigate its menu. Alternatively, the Gustard H16 has a recessed volume scroll wheel, which also is free speeding, but at least has incremental clicks for tactile feedback. But to be honest, I subjectively prefer the SA-1's volume knob. And sometimes it's little things like that which have a lingering impression on people. In short, the SA-1 performed perfectly well throughout my time with it. It fit right in amongst my other desktop amps and connected without difficulty to any of my DACs. In Phase 2, I plugged the SA-1 into various DACs using an XLR switch box so that I could determine if there's any alteration to the sound. I've previously reviewed and tested all of those DACs, and they're all flat, neutral, transparent. Anyway, after volume matching the sources using Voicemeeter Banana on Windows, it was patently obvious that the SA-1 does nothing to alter the analog signal. In Phase 3, I compared the SA-1 to a number of alternative amps. Once again, I tested and reviewed all of those competitors. They are all indeed transparent. Using an XLR switch box and volume matching the amps, there was no audible difference at all. While the SA-1 definitely got louder at its highest gain mode, I never got the impression that it was more dynamic or lively or analog or otherworldly, which are the types of comments you'll hear from audiophiles about completely transparent gear. Of course, if you listen to any of these amps louder than any other you're comparing, you will have a different perception. Perceived loudness impacts how we experience the music. You can find science-backed studies on this subject. They all lead to similar conclusions. Humans tend to prefer louder sounds. You can conduct a very simple experiment yourself. If you have two amplification sources and some A/B switches, you can construct a test bench. Make one of the amplifiers louder than the other. Over a given period of time, say 10 or 15 minutes, listen to one, then switch to the other while replaying the same music. You might find that the louder amp presents greater dynamics or slam or details. In reality, your ears are simply picking up sounds more easily because the volume is increased, and some previously subtle details stand out more to you. There's also a real-world experiment you can do without equipment. Go to any music venue where there are live instruments. If you subjectively compare what you hear at 100 feet away to 20 feet away, you'll probably conclude that when you stand closer to the music, you hear better. You might even say that you're more engaged, or the music is more lively or more detailed when you're up close. The music hasn't changed, the volume at which they are being played hasn't changed. Your ability to hear has altered as you've gotten closer, however. Anyway, As I said, if you volume match, there's no difference in sound signature among any of these amplifiers. Finally, in Phase 4, I compared various headphones to determine if the SA-1 struggled to drive them. The simple answer is no, it did not. There's not a single headphone in my collection that required more power than the SA-1 could generate. The Argon, the Headphone, T1, the LCD2, and many others got plentiful power for peak performance. One aspect of the SA-1 is that when I used it in high gain mode, some of the headphones distorted at higher volumes. This is not necessarily a fault with the amp, but instead the consequence of pumping so much power into headphones that weren't designed for it. Low impedance headphones really suffered with this, I think. ASR measured the SA-1 a few years ago. Its findings included that this amp has a flat response, which is not surprising, but it also found that the power output of the SA-1 is quite high. When you compare ASR's measurements and Singxer's purported maximum output, you see there is a correlation. I wish ASR had conducted these measurements at 16, 32, and 600 ohms so we could directly compare, but the 350 ohm measurements that are provided are still helpful. In short, ASR seems to corroborate that the SA-1's promised power output is likely accurate. To me, this is a big positive. We have regularly seen other companies play games with promised power output. SMSL and Topping have in the past been found being less than honest, using higher than typical voltage to achieve their power measurements. But it seems here, with the SA-1, that is not the case. Overall, the SA-1 is a very good amp. It is sturdy, powerful, and, yes, transparent. To be honest, I do not understand the addiction some audiophiles have with more power. You'll constantly hear excuses for why you need the most powerful amp, and some of these explanations are truly bizarre. For example, some will claim that all headphones have their own characteristics, which play better or worse with a given amplifier. Some say that these headphones are picky, and in this list of so-called picky headphones are dynamic drivers, which are actually really easy to drive. But the most common excuse is that you should buy the most powerful amp you can afford for the headroom. But 10 watts? Even 5 watts seems like an absurd amount of power. That's like paving a runway in your backyard because you hope that one day you will learn to fly a plane. There is no headphone anywhere that needs 10 watts of power. Even the comparatively more modest 6 or 3 watts seems unnecessary for most applications. But to each their own. You don't have to use all that power, and the SA-1 lets you select high or low gain. The SA-1 is essentially a basic amplifier. Its connection options are no different from many other amps. Other than Class A power, and a lot of power at that, the SA-1 doesn't offer anything unique. I don't see the rationale in spending $600 for something that you're unlikely to ever utilize to its fullest potential. But then we face products like the Rupert Neve headphone amplifier, which retails for just under $600. This thing has none of the features of the SA-1, but is generally highly praised among audiophiles and professionals. The Rupert Neve heritage has a lot to do with that price tag, I'm sure. I'd say that purchasing the RNHP also does not make a ton of sense, given the multitude of cheaper and equally good options available. What the SA-1 shows is that while it is expensive, it is also a capable device, and one that does not resort to THX gimmicks. Ultimately, I think the SA-1 is a fine amp. It's clearly not the most expensive amplifier we've ever seen, but if you're in the market for a well-built, powerful device, you could save a lot of money and buy the shit Magnus as an alternative. Personally, I can't use the power the SA-1 has to offer. I don't see the need for it. But if you can make an excuse for buying the SA-1, then I think you will end up with a very good amplifier.